Thank you very much. Like Sule said, my name is Mislove. I'm currently at the College of Computer Information Science at Northeastern University. I'd also like to thank the various program managers here who I know for the invitation to come and speak to you. It's something that's dear to my heart, and I'd like to be able to talk about this. So before I really get into my recommendations and my experience with the career program, I want to give you a little background on my trajectory and where I'm at. So like I said, I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Northeastern University. I started in the fall of 2009. I did my PhD at Rice University and finished up my degree in Germany at a Max Planck Institute. My area of research is in systems and networks. So so the focus is leveraging social networks in computer systems, showing that we can take ideas from social networks to solve either systems or security problems. So that's really sort of where I tend to publish, and also sort of what my career is centered around. The conferences I tend to publish in are NSDI, SIGCOMM, IMC, and so forth. I applied for my career the first time in summer of 2010, and it was awarded. So I was extremely fortunate to get it on the first try. I think part of that is due to the fact that when I accepted my job at Northeastern, in about June of 2009, I went to my advisor and was just sort of talking with him, and I said, oh, well, I'm thinking of sending out a career this year. And hadn't really done much at that point. He sort of looked at me like I had two heads, because these things take time. So I actually decided to wait a year, worked on it a little bit during the year, and then really started working on it once the semester ended and submitted in the summer of 2010. So I didn't submit the first time, but you can sort of count me as having at least thought about it for a long time. Like Sule said, my career is sort of supported by the CSR division. Dr. Good is actually my program manager. And in addition to this career, in 2009, I received another NSF award that was collaborative with some folks at the University of Maryland. And in the meantime, I've served on 4 NSF panels. Okay, so I'll give you some context for where my perspective is coming from. And again, this is the perspective of one person, so take it with a grain of salt. So the goal in this talk is really to just relate my experience and my advice on writing a successful career proposal. What I really want to do is talk about 3 things. The first, I'll go over my proposal. I'll go over it in a little bit of depth, mostly to sort of show you how I structured it. You're probably not interested in the technical details, but more like how I pitched it and why I think I found my proposal to be compelling, and I think the reviewers did as well. Second, I will take a step back and then come up with a list of sort of my suggestions for what to think about when writing your proposal. These are a little bit of things I wish I had known. And then third, I'll put together a list of some of the lessons I have sort of learned from serving on panels. Like some of the previous speakers have said, it's extremely informative to see the process from the inside, and I'll talk about some of the things that I learned in doing so. And also, I do have some time for questions, so I think we're not doing them at the end, but if you have questions, just shout them out, and I'll answer them. So, okay? Cool. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about my proposal. So the title of it is Systems for the Emerging Patterns of Content Exchange. And whenever I write proposals, I like to take a step back and say, why is this an important problem, right? And one of the most convincing ways to argue that is to argue that there are trends. There are things that are changing. And we, in the research community, need to respond to those trends. So the trend that I was motivated by was the idea that online social services, sort of Web 2.0, Facebook, MySpace, Gmail, whatever, are changing the way that we exchange content. And I made the case that we, as researchers, need to respond to that. Okay, so my research is very much motivated by trends. Again, as one of the previous speakers said, you can actually get my proposal via FOIA request. So if you want it, just email me. I'll save you the paperwork. Just don't distribute it, please. And so what I want to do is discuss sort of the motivation, so how I set up my proposal, go over the research plan, and then the education plan in my proposal. And I'll also talk about the reviews that I got back. So let's talk about the motivation. Again, I'm motivated by trends. I'm motivated by the rise of online social networks and other Web 2.0 sites. And the case that I made is that content exchange, the way that we're exchanging content, is changing. So why is this important to me as a systems and networking person? Well, the reason is that what it's changing from a systems perspective is where the content is being generated, right? So if you think of Web 1.0, all of the content was generated in the center of the network by the New York Times, by the media organizations. And we were distributing that content to the edge, right? So if you think of it from a pure network perspective, the content's generated in the center and distributed to the edge. So what's the trend? What's the change? Well, in sort of social media sites, the content is generated by the users themselves. These are users located at the edge of the network, me on my cell phone and so forth, right? And it's being shared with other people at the edge of the network. And there's significant geographic locality. So what you see is that the workload is now from the edge of the network to the edge of the network, right? And so as a result, we as systems people need to respond to that. So in terms of the research, I propose 3 main research thrusts. The first is rethinking content distribution. The fact that the workload is different, so we need to distribute the content in a different manner. Second, we need new mechanisms to allow users to express privacy. And third, we need to rethink our API for building distributed applications. I make the case that the way that we're talking about distributed applications is changing, and we need to respond to that. Now, each one of these, I'm motivated by an effect of this trend. So in terms of rethinking content distribution network design, I argue that because the content is generated in a different place, we need to distribute it differently, and thus that fell out. In terms of new mechanisms to express privacy policies, the change is that users themselves are controlling their content. If you think of it 10 years ago, your parents were not in charge of managing content, but they are today. When they go to Facebook, they have to decide who's able to access their content. These are lay users, right? And so as a result, we need to rethink the way that we're expressing privacy. And then third, the sort of really popular applications today are things like Facebook apps. They're not necessarily distributed applications. And so as a result, we need to rethink the way that applications talk about naming, and they care about users and not IP addresses and so forth, right? So that's sort of, I set it up as a trend, have 3 effects, and then research motivated by each one of those effects. And what you'll note is that each one of these trends, or each one of these research thrusts is increasingly speculative. The first one, I actually had some very concrete ideas. I showed some evidence that it's possible. The second one, I had, some a little bit less concrete ideas. And the third was, a little bit out there, right? But you want to show that you have a vision. And I found that proposals that, show, because this is a 5-year grant, you really want to think beyond just small technical contributions, right? So in terms of the education plan, I did a couple of things. The first, I proposed 2 new courses. One that was sort of a typical graduate level seminar in my research area. Almost, I think every proposal I've ever read does this. And the second was a more non-traditional course aimed at freshmen, not computer scientists, right? And this was looking at people from sociology, people from psychology, arguing that the sort of things that my research is touching on derive ideas from these areas, and we could sort of integrate these students, expose computer science to them, get them talking, and so forth. Second, I leveraged the interdisciplinary nature of social computing. I talked about recruiting PhD students with diverse backgrounds who wouldn't normally be interested in computer science, collaborating with psychologists and political scientists, and these have actually worked out. I have some co-advised students with some of these folks. And then third, using social media and sort of research on social media to attract and engage underrepresented CS students. I argued that, for example, I'm working with some high school students, I'm working with multiple female PhD students, and so forth. And the other thing I included in my education plan, and I think Keith talked about this, was an evaluation plan. Like, how am I going to measure the success of the things that I proposed? You include this in your intellectual merit and your research, but you also should include this in your education plan. So a lot of people ask me sort of how much space do I dedicate to various things. I sort of just included a rough estimate here. One of the things is when I say background, what I mean is not related work, because 2.5 pages of related work is way too much, but motivation. So I was arguing that these trends were happening, and the background there was really data I had collected from Facebook showing that this is happening in practice, showing that the way that content's being distributed is different. So this is really setting up the problem, is what I mean by background. Okay. So I submitted it. I received the results. It was funded. I was very fortunate. And I got back a panel summary. And I've highlighted here in both green and red. So the green's the good stuff, the red's the not so good stuff. And you can take a look, and you can, if you want my slides, just email me. I'm happy to send it. But if you scan this, you'll see that the panelists really like the bold vision. They like that it'll have impact and so forth. But then some of the things that they sort of weren't so impressed with was that the ideas themselves were not revolutionary. So they like the high impact. They like those sorts of things. But the actual concrete ideas maybe weren't as revolutionary as the impact could be. Second, in terms of broader impact, they very much liked it. They really liked the interdisciplinary nature. They liked how the intrinsic appeal of social networking leveraged to reach a broad audience, and so forth. And so overall, I was placed in competitive, And the reason for that was the vision was bold and the broader impacts likely to be significant. So the way I read this was that my proposal was above the bar for funding, but I think what really got my proposal funded was the broader impacts. So to address some of the questions before, you can really stand out by doing very novel, very interesting things in broader impact. And really, I cannot stress enough, spend time thinking about that. Don't just include boilerplate stuff in your broader impacts. OK, so that's all for my proposal. Any questions? Nope? OK. So I'm going to go on and sort of, I tried to just think while I was preparing this talk about what suggestions I would have for other people preparing proposals. And most of this has been covered. Again, the important thing to remember about the career program is that it's a bit different than a normal NSF proposal. Normal NSF proposals really are looking at intellectual merit. And these, the point of it is to bootstrap your career, to get you on the right track as a faculty member. And you can read this if you read the solicitation. The point is to build a firm foundation for a lifetime of leadership in integrating research and education. So in terms of preparations, things you should have done already, you should make sure you sign up for a grants.gov or Fastlane account. Sometimes that your university has to approve it. Make sure you've done that. You don't want to, like, a week before the deadline, realize you don't have that. Second, request the eligibility letter. Third, request copies of other proposals. So I did this when I first showed up at Northeastern. I got about 7 or 8 from both people at my college and other colleagues who I knew. It's extremely useful. Just sit there and read them. See how they're structured. See the vision. See the scope, and so forth. The other thing you should remember is that if this is your first time submitting a grant, most universities have a 1-week requirement where you have to give it to the sponsored research office. So you do have actually 1 week less than the deadline. So a lot of people don't realize that. And then lastly, I think this was spoken on before, talk to people about your research ideas. That's actually what I spent that 1 year before, but when I decided not to submit to when I did, to really hone down what's interesting, what's your key contribution, what's the vision. Right? I found that talking to visitors to my department, talking to people at conferences, that was extremely useful. In terms of choosing your objective, you should sort of think big. Think about, this is a 5-year award. That's a long-term award. If successful, how will you help your discipline? How will you help society? You should think long-term. The point is to bootstrap your career. How will you use this funding to integrate yourself to become a successful member of the research community? And then very much think about how you integrate education and research. How will you specifically, with the ideas you're proposing, integrate that into education? And remember, NSF does like to fund high risk, high reward. So I've been on panels where there have been multiple proposals, one that's sort of low risk, low reward, high risk, high reward. They will go for the high risk almost every time, if relatively equivalent. So think about something that's a bit visionary. So I think that the motivation, sort of the first page, the project summary, and the first 2 pages of the project description are the most important parts of your proposal. Because think about it from a reviewer's perspective. You've got this stack of proposals, right? And you're reading them, and you're going to, you make an opinion in the first couple of pages. And your opinion can change, but if you read this and you're excited at the beginning, like, wow, this is really cool, you're going to be much more excited. You're going to stand up in the panel and say, no, this is actually a really cool proposal. So spend the time on those first couple of pages. Right? You want to convince the reviewer that you're looking at a challenging problem. You have an interesting approach. For me, I want to know what's your insight, what's your idea. Because I'll read proposals where I don't understand. Like, they're talking about an interesting problem, but I have no idea what their insight is. I want you to tell me what's your novel insight. What have people not done before that you're going to do? Right? You want to argue that your proposal would have impact, is successful, and that you have a 5-year plan. Right? Finally, you want to argue why you're the right PI for this project. You want to, what's your expertise? Do you have a track record in the general area? Obviously, you don't want to have done it already. But if you're going to do something for systems, do you have how to publish systems papers? And also, you want to talk a little bit about your institutional context. Right? In other words, are you in an environment where you have the infrastructure necessary to be able to complete this project? In terms of the research plan, you want to describe related work. I wouldn't spend more than a page or so describing related work. It gets a bit tedious. Your goal here is to demonstrate your knowledge of the area, that you've done your homework, and that your proposal is novel. And so you really just describe what other people have done, and describe, but I'm looking at this, and they looked at this, or I'm doing it this way, and they did it this way. Okay? So make sure that you have sufficient related work, but don't go overboard. And I find it's always helpful if you can describe motivating examples or some sort of preliminary work or case studies. For example, in my proposal, I was talking about these trends. I had some data from Facebook that we had collected, and I actually included the data, included some graphs as motivation, right? That goes a long way to convincing a skeptical reviewer that your idea holds water, right? So including that sort of in the beginning of your research plan is very helpful. Describe the proposed work for something like a career. The way I did it was some tasks are a bit more concrete, some tasks are a bit more speculative and so forth. But that sort of shows a series of tasks that will lead to success. And finally, have an evaluation plan. Have a way of declaring victory. Have a way of arguing that your proposal was successful. Okay. In terms of broader impacts, remember the NSF wants to see evidence of teacher scholars. And I found that this was probably the hardest part of my proposal to write because we're not trained, at least in our PhD, to really write about broader impacts. We know how to write papers. We don't know how to do this. So what I did is I sort of sat down and thought, what is unique about my proposal that other proposals don't have? And how can I leverage what is unique? So a few things you may consider is, can you have impact on other disciplines? Things like, for me, it was sociology and so forth. Can you somehow involve underrepresented groups? Now, this is hard because I'll see a lot of proposals that just say, we will involve underrepresented groups, and that's it, right? And then reviewers don't like that. So, you should really think about how exactly will I do this? Outreach programs that we already talked about, novel ways of integrating education, high school students, K through 12, and so forth. And then you can talk a little bit about benefits to society. I find that always is a bit fluffy, but you can do it. Other things to think about include tech transfer. If you have an idea that may impact society by actually getting commercialized, you can talk about that. But you should talk about it in a concrete way. Talk about here are the companies that may be interested in this. If you can get a letter of support from them, that would be great. So in general, the thing to remember in broader impacts is be concrete, right? If you're going to say, I will involve REUs, talk about what parts of your proposal will you involve the undergraduates with, right? Don't just say, I will involve undergraduates, because then the reviewer's like, oh, he's thought about this, right? If you're going to propose a new course, don't just say that, say which one. Who are you going to target it to? Talk about, so what at a rough level, what sort of syllabus are you going to include, and so forth. So just be concrete in your broader impacts, and integrate them well with your proposal. Okay, the other thing you have to include is, or that I would recommend including, is a schedule. So this is sort of, just roughly lay out your tasks, how you see them, what you think you will work on at different times. Of course, this will change, but it gives the reviewer some idea of what you're thinking about the scope of each one. So I like to include a Gantt chart. These are largely contentless. Here's an example from my career proposal. But it's better than like a table with a list of numbers. So be sure to list results from other NSF support. And they don't want to see the grants you have because that'll probably show up in your current and pending. But they want to see the results of those grants. So if you have papers that have come out of that, students you're advising and so forth, list that. And then in career proposal, I think there's a section called accomplishments of the PI. For that, list, so you want to toot your own horn a little bit, list best paper awards, any press coverage, service you've had to the discipline, if you're on program committees and whatnot. Show that you're part of the discipline. I think that goes a long way to convincing reviewers. Okay, a few random things. Include explicit intellectual merit and broader impact statements in both the summary and the first 2 pages of your description. Right? I think it's required in the summary and it's highly recommended in a description. Include your timeline. The data management plan is very important. It's required on all NSF proposals now. And data management, some people write this to talk only about the data that results. It doesn't just include that. It includes all of the code, any intermediate data, anything like that that's not included as a publication falls under data management plan. So you should think about this and think about, will you make your data available to others? If so, how are you going to do that? Are you going to put it on a website? If not, why not? How are you going to archive it? How are you going to keep it around? Right? So those are the things to think about in your data management plan. And finally, if you're doing anything close to human subjects, have a discussion of IRB. You might need to talk to people at your university. Some universities require that you have IRB sort of approval before you submit the proposal. It varies by university, but if you're talking about, I've read proposals where people will hand out cell phones to people and track them all day, and they didn't talk about IRB at all, right? And that's very scary. So think about that. This is largely echoing other people. Get people to read your proposal. Ask for brutal feedback. You don't want people just to be nice to you. You want to really have them sort of tear the proposal apart. Attend the workshops like you're doing today. Some people say to meet with program managers. I didn't do that, but you can. And then finally, don't be discouraged by a declined proposal. Statistically, that's the most likely outcome. But read the reviews and read the summaries carefully, right? That you can learn a lot from that, and you can really increase your probability the next time if you pay attention to those, right? And respond to the reviews. Really see what you can learn from that. So I want to talk, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of lessons I've learned from the NSF panels, right? What have I learned from the inside, right? And so this was largely covered, but I'll go over it just one more time. So the proposals are sent into NSF. They're divided roughly into groups based on area. Program managers recruit panelists. So I think for career proposal, it's mostly senior folks in the area. I have not been on a career panel. I've been on other ones. Panelists are given 8 to 10 roughly proposals. 3 weeks before the panel, they submit reviews. These are sort of the ratings that they can give. And then everyone meets at NSF for 1 to 2 days. And the panel collectively will discuss every proposal in depth. And collectively, they'll write a summary of what the panel discussion was. And you'll fall into one of the 4 categories that Keith talked about earlier. So a few of the lessons and pitfalls that I've learned, it's very useful to serve on an NSF panel. But all of my experience, again, is from non-career panels. The first thing is format your proposal well, right? I've read proposals where they didn't violate the formatting guidelines, but they came like within epsilon of violating them. And they're like reducing the margins down to the very minimum, reducing the indentation, including figures in the middle of text. It makes it just really hard for a reviewer to read your proposal. So just because it says you can use 10 point, feel free to use 11. It's OK, right? And leave white space. Include diagrams where you can. Don't use weird typography. I see people like boxing stuff and underlying stuff and bolding stuff all over the place. It really actually just becomes distracting. So you can do a little bit of that, but try to keep it to a minimum. Spend the time to wordsmith. Really go over, especially your first 2 pages. Make sure it flows. Make sure it makes sense. There aren't any grammatical errors, of course, but you really want it to be a nicely written proposal. And don't use boilerplate educational tasks, things like I will propose a course. Really be concrete about what exactly relates to this proposal that you'll be doing. Fourth, cover the related work. You don't want a reviewer to be able to do a Google search and then come up with something that you don't cite that's very much related to your proposal. So make sure that you're covering the related work. You're describing why you're different than what's been done. You want to show independence. So collaborations are OK, but you want to make sure they don't dominate the proposal. You want to make it clear this is you're the PI for this. This is bootstrapping your career. You don't want to, and you want to make sure you move beyond your prior work. You don't want to be sort of the next step in your thesis. You want to be something new. Take the data management plan and the mentoring plan very seriously. The panel does discuss it for every proposal. Mentoring plans are only for postdocs, so they probably won't be on career proposals. But the data management plan is discussed. And NSF will return it without a review if you don't include it. And finally, I've observed that letters of support are sometimes viewed with a bit of skepticism. Because they want to make sure it's not just you pinging somebody at Google to say, yes, we like this. So if your letter of support happens to include something like data or people who will collaborate with you or even funding, that's much stronger than a letter of support that just says, yay, Alan's awesome. So that's sort of what you're looking for. But again, this is sometimes hard for junior faculty. Make sure you follow the grant proposal guidelines. The GPGs, they change often, or not that often, but just make sure that you're well within the requirements. Make sure you explain things well. The reviewers will be people in your general area, but not people who are in your specific area. So you should make sure that you set the background right, so people who aren't intimately familiar with your work will be able to understand it. Make sure the career is not a major infrastructure grant, so if you need very specific equipment, you should argue why you already have it or you have access to it. And again, think high risk, high reward. You want to show a vision. Right. So the last thing I have is I highly recommend serving on a panel. One thing you can do is you can send introductory emails to program managers saying, hi, I'm a new faculty here. This is my area of expertise. I'd be happy to serve on a panel. And if you're invited, you should absolutely accept. It's a great thing to do. The workloads, you read about 10 panels and you go to NSF for 2 days, and it's incredibly enlightening on how the process works and why. It really helps you to understand why reviews are written the way they are, what panel summaries mean, and it really helps you to increase the quality of your own proposals. So with that, I'm done, and I guess we don't have time for questions, but thank you.